Hello and welcome to Chapter 12, Monopolistic Competition and Oligopoly. We're going to spend some time on monopolistic competition, but we're going to spend most of our time on oligopoly. So here's what we're going to do. So we've already looked at perfectly competitive markets. We've looked at one kind of imperfectly competitive markets. So we looked at monopoly. So we've got perfect competition, then we've got imperfect competition. So there's a few different types of market structures under imperfect competition. So we've looked at monopoly. This time we're going to look at monopolistic competition, which has some features of monopoly and a lot of features like perfect competition. Then we're going to look at oligopoly, where there's just a few firms in industry. And then cartels are a type of oligopoly where the firms, rather than compete with each other, they decide to get together and act in a way such that they can act more like a monopoly. Okay, so the three types of imperfectly competitive markets we're going to look at is monopoly. We've already looked at that. One seller, no close substitutes. Monopolistic competition, lots of firms in the industry. However, the products are somewhat differentiated. So unlike perfect competition, where we have perfect substitutes, homogeneous products, we have product differentiation in monopolistic competition. So lots of firms, free entry and exit, however, differentiated products. Oligopoly is another type of imperfectly competitive markets where it's kind of like monopoly, except instead of just one seller, there's a few sellers, and so then if they're going to compete, they have to figure out how their rival firms are going to react to whatever they decide to do. So one thing that we look at with oligopoly is strategic interaction. However, if they decide not to compete and decide to get together and coordinate their actions in order to reduce output and jack up the price and act more like a monopoly, their profits are higher, but it's hard to do. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. So let's quickly review perfect competition. We've got lots of firms, perfect substitutes. Another name for it is homogeneous products. So everybody's selling the exact same thing. Because of that, the demand curve facing each firm in the industry is perfectly elastic. Industry demand curve is downward sloping. Because each firm has a perfectly elastic demand curve, it can change output all they want, and the price doesn't change, so no ability to influence the price. Key here is there's free entry and exit, and so as long as there's free entry and exit in any industry, the long run profits have to be zero. Now quickly back to monopoly. Monopoly, we've got one seller, not perfect substitutes. So it's the only firm that's making what it is making. So it's got differentiated product. Because of that, not perfectly elastic demand curve. It's got a negatively sloped demand curve. As it changes output, it can influence the price. So it has to search not only for the optimal output, but also for the optimal price. There's some barriers to entry to keep other firms out, and because of that, then there's economic profits, not only in the short run, but also in the long run. Okay. So now, let's first look at monopolistic competition. Kind of like perfectly competitive markets in that there are lots of firms in the industry. However, instead of perfect substitutes, they're close substitutes. Products are somewhat differentiated. And so the demand curve facing each individual firm is negatively sloped to some degree. It's probably fairly elastic, but it's negatively sloped. And so it's got some ability to influence the price by changing output. Here's the key, though, is like perfect competitive market, it's got free entry and exit. So as long as you have that, long run profits might be zero. So now let's think. We've got a firm that just came up with something new. So in the short run, it's going to be a monopolist, make monopoly profits. But in the long run, as long as there's no barriers to entry, we're going to have entry. And those economic profits will get driven to zero in the long run. So here's what we have at first. We've got, it's the only firm in the industry for right now. It's got a negatively sloped demand curve, corresponding marginal revenue curve. It equates marginal revenue with marginal cost, produces this output, and goes up to the demand curve and charges this price. So in the short run, it's got some profits because price exceeds average total cost. And so here's the per unit profit times the amount that they produce, and so here's profits. Is that a long run equilibrium if there's no barriers to entry? No. So if you have barriers to entry, firms enter, the supply increases, then the price gets driven down. When does entry stop? When there's no more economic profits. So here's the demand curve for the monopolistically competitive firm in the long run. Negatively sloped. It's probably going to. One thing I don't like about this is as entry occurs and there's more substitutes for the firm's product, the demand curve for the firm is going to become more elastic over time. But let's just take this for what it is. So we've got a negatively sloped demand curve. Here's marginal revenue. It equates marginal revenue with marginal cost, produces this, goes up to the demand curve, charges this price. However, what's average total cost at this point? Right there. What's price at this point? Right there. So total revenue is going to equal total cost, so there's zero economic profits. That's monopolistic competition right there. We got a negatively sloped demand curve, no economic profits in the long run. Okay, so if this was a perfectly competitive industry, we would have this output being produced by a monopolistically competitive firm. So instead of producing this much, it restricts output, jacks up the price, and so there's some deadweight loss. Again, no economic profits because price equals average total cost. Okay, so there's some deadweight loss. The more elastic the demand curve, the smaller the deadweight loss. And so there's some economic inefficiency, there's some deadweight loss. Do antitrust authorities get hot and bothered about it? Not much. Do economists get hot and bothered about it? Not much, because most of these markets, the deadweight loss is going to be small because the demand curve for these firms are pretty elastic. And so there's some degree of economic inefficiency. That's the downside. However, the upside is we've got, unlike perfect competition, where everybody's selling the exact same thing, we've got some degree of product diversity here. And so some people might like one cola over another, and so some people might like one brand of toothpaste over another. They're all pretty close, but you've got some degree of choice. And so the value to consumers in terms of their ability to choose probably outweighs any loss of economic efficiency. And so antitrust authorities don't get overly worried about monopolistic competitive industries. So here's some examples of the elasticity of demand. So like I said, for most of these, the elasticity of demand is pretty big. And so the amount of deadweight loss is going to be pretty small. So here's RC Cola. It's still fairly elastic. Here's chock full of nuts coffee. It's fairly elastic. But so anyway, so it says on elasticity of between -4 and 8, limited monopoly power. This is what we usually have in monopolistic competitive industries, so we don't really worry about it. So what's the problem here? The problem is that we've got differentiated products, some degree of price searching, but you don't have a whole lot of market power. If you do, so think of this firm in the short run. It was the only firm making whatever it came up with. It's making some monopoly profits. Okay, so it's got some market power, and market power, monopoly profits are big. They attract other firms, and so what happens when you have entry? With entry, the supply increases, price goes down, and think about the amount of substitutes for each firm's product. Where there's more and more people making stuff that's fairly close, so you've got more close substitutes being developed, so the demand curve becomes more elastic over time. So not only is the price going down, the demand curve is being more elastic, less market power, less ability to mark up the price over marginal cost, lower profits. Okay, so that's the problem. And so firms, if they can prevent entry into the industry, they make money. And so there's lots of pressure on firms to try to restrict entry into the industry, and that's what we're going to look at in part 2.